My family treats me like a doormat. Now, they are planning a cruise without me, and assuming I'd stay behind to babysit their kids. The air in the living room was thick with the cloying sweetness of buttercream frosting and the sour undertone of familial obligation. It was my son Leo's first birthday, a milestone that should have been joyous, a celebration of the tiny, perfect life my husband Tom and I had created. Instead, it felt like a performance, a carefully staged play where I was the unwilling lead, and my mother-in-law, Eleanor, was the director, producer, and star. She moved through the room with a proprietary grace, accepting compliments on the decorations she'd insisted on choosing and the cake she'd ordered, as if she were the one who had endured 27 hours of labor and the subsequent year of sleepless, soul-shredding, beautiful exhaustion. I was propped on the sofa, a weak smile cemented to my face, feeling the familiar, heavy fog settle over my mind. For months, it had been my constant companion, a creeping lethargy, a confusion that made simple thoughts feel like wading through mud. The doctors had called it postpartum depression, anxiety, the natural toll of new motherhood. Eleanor called it incompetence. Tom was circulating, a proud father showing off his heir, oblivious to the tension coiling in my gut. He saw his mother as a pillar of strength, a woman who had stepped up when I was struggling. He didn't see the way her eyes, the same cool blue as his, would linger on me with a chilling mixture of pity and contempt. He didn't hear the subtle digs disguised as concern, the constant erosion of my confidence, one passive-aggressive comment at a time. "Oh, Sarah, you look so tired, dear. Are you sure you're getting enough iron? Let me fix you a special tonic. Leo seems a bit fussy with you today. Why don't you let me take him? You go rest." She had become a permanent fixture in our home, a benevolent tyrant in a cashmere sweater, and with every passing day, I felt myself shrinking, dissolving into the background of my own life. The party was winding down. Guests were collecting their coats and offering their final, saccharine goodbyes. My Uncle David, my mother's brother and the only real family I had left, gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. His eyes, warm and worried, met mine. "You holding up, kiddo?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble of genuine concern. I tried to give him a reassuring nod, but the effort felt monumental. The fog was thicker than ever, my limbs heavy as lead. I just wanted to sleep for a week and wake up feeling like myself again. Finally, it was just us. Me, Tom, Leo, who was now blissfully asleep in his crib upstairs, and Eleanor. She was directing Tom in the cleanup with the efficiency of a field marshal, while I remained on the sofa, feeling pinned down by an invisible weight. "Tom, darling, be a dear and run those last few bags out to the recycling bin, would you?" she said, her voice smooth as honey. "I'll just make sure Sarah is settled before I head home." Tom, ever the dutiful son, kissed my forehead a brief distracted peck and disappeared out the back door. The moment the door clicked shut, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The pretense of warmth evaporated, leaving a stark, arctic chill in its place. Eleanor turned to face me. The benevolent smile was gone, replaced by a look of undisguised triumph. She picked up the small, delicate teacup from the coffee table, the one she had insisted I drink from earlier. It had contained one of her special chamomile blends to calm my nerves. She swirled the dregs at the bottom. "You know, Sarah," she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I have to hand it to you. You've lasted longer than I expected. Most people would have shattered by now." I stared at her, the fog in my brain parting just enough to register the malice in her tone. "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" My voice was a weak croak. She let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Oh, please, don't play the simpleton. It's so unbecoming. This whole fragile, broken little bird act?" She gestured around the room, at the remnants of a party that had celebrated my son, my life. "It's all been a bit much for you, hasn't it? The baby, the responsibility. You're just not cut out for it. It's a shame, really. Tom deserved a stronger wife. Leo deserves a more stable mother." Every word was a perfectly sharpened dart, aimed at the most vulnerable parts of my soul. I tried to push myself up, to summon some semblance of defiance, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It felt like my muscles had been replaced with wet sand. "I'm a good mother," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Are you?" she countered, her eyes glittering. She took a step closer, her shadow falling over me. "A good mother doesn't forget things. A good mother isn't constantly exhausted, confused, weepy. A good mother doesn't need to be medicated just to get through the day." She leaned in, her voice dropping even lower, a venomous hiss that slid directly into my ear. "That's the beauty of it. It's all so plausible. A history of anxiety, the overwhelming stress of a new baby. It paints the perfect picture, doesn't it? A woman on the verge of a complete breakdown, a sliver of pure, cold adrenaline cut through the chemical haze. Medicated," she had said, medicated. The chamomile tea, the special tonics, the vitamins she insisted I take every morning. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "What did you do?" I managed to ask, the words catching in my throat. Eleanor smiled, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. It was the most honest expression I had ever seen on her face. "I helped you," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "I simply gave you what you so clearly needed. A little something to take the edge off. A little something to, well, to make you more manageable. A little bit of lorazepam in your tea, a crushed tablet in your morning smoothie. It's a mild benzodiazepine, you know, harmless in small doses. But over time, well, the cumulative effect is quite impressive. It mimics all the symptoms of a nervous breakdown quite beautifully. Confusion, drowsiness, memory loss, emotional instability. The world tilted on its axis. The fog wasn't in my head. It was being put there. This wasn't postpartum depression. This was poisoning. My own mother-in-law had been systematically drugging me for months, turning me into a ghost in my own home, a stranger to myself. The confession was so brazen, so utterly devoid of remorse that it defied all logic. She was gloating, savoring the revelation, convinced of her absolute power over me. She believed I was too weak, too sedated, too broken to do anything about it. She straightened up, casting a final, dismissive glance at my prone form. Tom is already so worried about you. It won't take much more to convince him that you're a danger to yourself, and more importantly, to Leo. A court will see it too. They'll see a loving grandmother, willing to step in and provide a stable home, and a mother who is, tragically, unwell. I'll take such good care of him, of both of them. Rage, pure and incandescent, surged through me, burning away the last vestiges of the drug-induced haze. It was a primal, protective fury, the likes of which I had never experienced. It was the roar of a mother whose child was threatened. I opened my mouth to scream, to curse her, to launch myself at her, but my traitorous body still refused to obey. All that came out was a strangled gasp, but I wasn't the only one who had heard her. In that moment, a floorboard creaked in the hallway just beyond the living room archway. Eleanor's head snapped toward the sound, her mask of triumphant cruelty faltering for the first time. She thought we were alone. She thought Tom was still outside, but I knew that creak. It was the spot right outside the guest bathroom, and I knew who had gone to use it just before the last of the guests had departed. Uncle David stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. His face, usually so kind and crinkled with laughter, was a mask of cold, hard fury. He held his phone in his hand, its screen dark, but his thumb was poised over it as if he had just ended a function. He hadn't just heard it. He had been standing there, silent and unseen, for the entire monstrous confession. Eleanor's face drained of all color. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure animal panic. "David," she stammered, attempting to rearrange her features into a semblance of normalcy. I was just trying to talk some sense into her. She's been so overwrought." "I heard what you were trying to do, Eleanor," David said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room. "I heard every single word." He looked from Eleanor's terrified face to me, still struggling on the couch. A profound sadness and a burning anger warred in his eyes. "And I have a feeling a few other people might be interested in hearing it too." He raised his phone slightly. The implication was clear. The dam of my shock finally broke. A raw, guttural sob ripped from my chest, a sound of such profound betrayal and horror that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was real, all of it. The sickness, the confusion, the feeling of losing my mind. It had all been a lie, a meticulously crafted campaign of psychological and chemical warfare waged against me by the one person who should have been a second mother, my husband's mother, my child's grandmother. Eleanor, seeing her entire scheme crumble before her eyes, made a desperate lunge for David's phone. But my uncle, a retired contractor who had spent 40 years hauling lumber and drywall, was deceptively strong. He caught her wrist in a grip of iron, stopping her cold. "Don't you dare," he growled, his voice resonating with a lifetime of quiet authority. The woman who had held me in her psychological thrall for a year looked, for the first time, small and pathetic. Just then, the back door opened, and Tom breezed in, a cheerful smile on his face. "All done. Now, who wants a nightcap?" He stopped dead, his smile faltering as he took in the scene. Me, a weeping wreck on the sofa, his mother, pale and panicked, locked in his uncle-in-law's grip, and the palpable atmosphere of violence and revelation hanging in the air. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "Mom? Uncle David? What happened?" David didn't release Eleanor's wrist. He looked straight at Tom, his expression grim. "Your mother has something she needs to tell you, Tom. Something you need to hear." He then looked down at the phone in his hand and pressed a button. From the small speaker, Eleanor's voice, clear as a bell, filled the silent room. "A little bit of lorazepam in your tea? A crushed tablet in your morning smoothie? It mimics all the symptoms of a nervous breakdown quite beautifully." The recording played on, every venomous word of her confession echoing in the cozy living room that had been my prison. Tom stood frozen, his face transforming from confusion to disbelief, then to a dawning, sickening horror. He looked at his mother, whose face had crumpled into a mask of desperation. He looked at me, at the tears streaming down my face, at the months of inexplicable illness and despair that now had a name, a face, a reason. The sound of his mother's voice, so calmly and proudly detailing her methodical abuse of his wife, was undeniable. The foundation of his world, his belief in his mother's unwavering goodness, was being systematically demolished with every recorded syllable. When the recording finished, a profound silence descended. Tom slowly turned his head to look at Eleanor, his blue eyes, once so full of adoration for her, now dark with a pain and betrayal so deep it seemed to cleave him in two. "Mom?" he whispered, the word a fragile, broken thing. "Tell me it's not true." Eleanor started to sob, the theatrical, self-pitying tears of a narcissist caught in the act. "She drove me to it, Tommy. She's unstable. I was just trying to help, to calm her down so she wouldn't hurt the baby." The lies were reflexive, pathetic attempts to cling to the wreckage of her credibility. But the proof was right there, in her own voice, gloating and cruel. David finally released her arm, shoving her away from him in disgust. "Save it, Eleanor," he said, his voice like gravel. He looked at Tom. "Your wife has been poisoned. By your mother. For months." He then turned his attention to me, his expression softening with a fierce protectiveness. "Sarah, I'm calling the police. And then I'm calling a lawyer." He didn't wait for an answer. He moved to the other side of the room, his back to us, and I could hear his low, steady voice speaking with a 911 operator, relaying the unthinkable facts of the situation with a calm that I couldn't begin to fathom. I watched Tom as he stared at his mother, the woman he had revered his entire life. The conflict in his face was agonizing. The son who loved his mother was at war with the husband who had just discovered the monster living under his own roof. The enabler was being forced to confront the actions of the aggressor, and the shock was paralyzing him. He didn't move toward me. He didn't move toward her. He just stood there, caught in the crossfire of a war he hadn't even known was being waged. And in that moment, I realized that Eleanor's betrayal was not the only one I would have to survive. I was truly, utterly alone in this marriage, and the fight for my life, my sanity, and my son had only just begun. The flashing blue and red lights that soon painted the walls of our living room were not an ending. They were a beginning. The beginning of a long, brutal, and necessary war. The hours that followed were a blur of uniformed officers, paramedics, and the sterile, impersonal language of official reports. I was taken to the hospital. A precautionary measure, they said. Tom followed in a daze, his silence a chasm between us. In the emergency room, they drew vial after vial of my blood, took urine samples, and clipped strands of my hair, sealing each one in a plastic bag with a label that felt like an epitaph for the life I once knew. A patient advocate, a kind woman named Maria with gentle eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, sat with me. She explained that the hair sample was crucial. While blood and urine would show recent exposure, hair could create a timeline, a chemical diary of the poison that had been fed to me over weeks and months. It was the first time someone had looked at me not as a hysterical new mother, but as a victim of a serious crime. It was the first small stone of validation laid on the path ahead. Eleanor was taken away in a police car. I didn't see it happen, but David described it to me later with grim satisfaction. She had dropped the weeping victim act the moment she realized it wasn't working and had become imperious and indignant, threatening the officers with her husband's powerful connections. It did her no good. She spent the night in a holding cell, a reality so far removed from her manicured country club existence that the thought brought me a sliver of dark, satisfying vindication. The next morning, David drove me home from the hospital. Tom had stayed at the house with Leo, and the reunion with my son was a tidal wave of emotion. I held him to my chest, breathing in his sweet, milky scent, and swore a silent, ferocious oath that I would never let anyone harm him or me again. The sight of my child, so perfect and innocent, was the fuel I needed. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting him from the poison in his own bloodline. David had already made the call. By 10 o'clock that morning, we were sitting in the polished mahogany office of a woman named Jessica Thorne. She wasn't just a lawyer. She was, as David had put it, a shark. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and a handshake that could crush stone. She listened to the entire story without interruption, her expression unreadable. David played the recording for her. When it was over, she leaned back in her leather chair, her fingertips steepled. "This is an exceptionally strong case," she said, her voice calm and measured. "The recording of her confession is a prosecutor's dream, but it's not going to be easy. Your mother-in-law's family has money and influence. They will hire the best defense team available. Their strategy will be simple and brutal: to destroy you." She looked directly at me, her gaze unwavering. "They will paint you as an unstable, vindictive, postpartum hysteric. They will use your history of anxiety against you. They will claim you doctored the recording. They will say you're a relapsed addict, that you confused your own medication with something she gave you. They will try to prove you are an unfit mother. Their goal is to discredit you so thoroughly that no jury will believe a word you say. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of Leo's face, of his tiny hand curled around my finger. I thought of the months I had lost, wandering in a fog of confusion and self-doubt, believing I was failing as a mother, as a person. I thought of Eleanor's triumphant, cruel smile. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I'm prepared." The first step was documentation. Jessica gave me a thick legal pad and a pen. "I want you to write down everything," she instructed. "Every single instance you felt unwell. Every time she gave you a special tonic or tea. Every condescending comment. Every time she undermined you in front of your husband. Dates, times, locations, what you felt, what she said, who was there. I want a complete timeline of your abuse. It will be painful, but it will be your most powerful weapon." That night, after Tom had retreated into the silent, cold fortress of the guest room and Leo was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and began to write. The memories came flooding back, a torrent of small, painful details that, when viewed together, formed a horrifying mosaic of manipulation. The headache that started every time she brought me my morning smoothie. The dizzy spell I had at the park after drinking the iced tea she'd packed. The argument with Tom, where I couldn't form a coherent sentence, my thoughts scattering like dust in the wind, while she watched with an expression of deep concern. Each memory was a small cut, and writing them down felt like reopening every single wound. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the pages were stained with tears, until the sun began to rise. By dawn, I had filled half the legal pad. It was a testament to my suffering, and as Jessica had predicted, it was agonizing. But it also felt like reclaiming my own story, taking the narrative back from the woman who had tried to steal it from me. My support system, though small, was mighty. Uncle David was my rock, a constant source of practical help and unwavering belief. He vetted lawyers, screened my calls, and ran interference with the bewildered and gossiping extended family. I also made another call, one that was difficult but necessary. I called my sponsor, a woman named Clara from a support group I had attended years ago for a brief but frightening dependency on prescription anxiety medication after my mother's death. I hadn't needed a meeting in years, but I needed one now. Clara listened to the whole sordid tale over coffee in a quiet diner. She didn't flinch. She just nodded, her expression full of a deep, knowing empathy. "Your sobriety is your superpower right now, Sarah," she told me, her voice firm. "Eleanor used your past vulnerability as a weapon, but you can turn it into your shield. You know what it feels like to be clear-headed. You know the difference between genuine anxiety and a chemical fog. You are the most reliable witness to your own experience. Don't let them take that away from you. Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves. She reminded me that my recovery was a source of strength, not shame. The first wave of Eleanor's retaliation came swiftly, just as Jessica had predicted. Her husband, a wealthy and powerful man named Robert, who had always treated me with polite indifference, posted her bail. The very next day, a process server arrived at my door and handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was an emergency motion for temporary custody of Leo, filed by Eleanor. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. The legal document, penned by a team of high-priced lawyers, painted me as a dangerously unstable woman with a long history of substance abuse and psychiatric issues. It alleged that I was suffering from a severe case of postpartum psychosis, that I had fabricated the wild allegations against my loving mother-in-law in a fit of paranoia. It claimed that I was a danger to my child and that Eleanor, the concerned grandmother, was seeking only to protect her beloved grandson from his deranged mother. Reading it felt like being flayed alive. Every vulnerability, every private fear I had ever confessed to Tom was twisted and weaponized against me. The anxiety I'd had after my mother died was reframed as a psychiatric breakdown. The brief, doctor-prescribed medication was now a history of drug addiction. The exhaustion of new motherhood was proof of my inability to cope. It was Eleanor's narrative, codified in legal jargon, and it was designed to utterly annihilate me. The worst part was Tom's reaction. I watched him read the document, his face pale and drawn. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. His mother's words, her version of reality, still had a powerful hold on him. "She's just scared, Sarah," he said, his voice pleading. "She's not thinking clearly. Maybe if we just talk to her, we could sort this out without all this." "Sort this out?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "She poisoned me, Tom. For months," she confessed. "You heard the recording. What is there to sort out?" "But what if she's right about some of it?" he faltered. "You haven't been yourself. You've been emotional, forgetful. Maybe she was just trying to help, and it went wrong. Maybe she was giving you something she thought was harmless, and you had a bad reaction." He was grasping at straws, desperately trying to construct a version of events where his mother wasn't a monster. He was trying to find a middle ground where no middle ground existed. That was the moment I knew my marriage was a casualty of this war. He was choosing his mother's lies over my reality. His weakness, his inability to stand up to her, was a deeper betrayal than I could have imagined. "There is no maybe, Tom," I said, my voice cold as ice. "There is only what she did, and if you can't see that, if you can't stand with me against her, then you are on her side. You need to leave." The words hung in the air between us, stark and final. The shock on his face was profound, but my resolve was absolute. I could not fight a war on two fronts. I could not fight Eleanor while also fighting to convince my own husband of the truth. He packed a bag that night and went to stay with a friend, leaving me and Leo alone in the house that no longer felt like a home, but a battlefield. The legal battle became a grinding war of attrition. Eleanor's lawyers filed motion after motion, demanding psychiatric evaluations, drug tests, and supervised visitation. Jessica, my shark, met them at every turn, filing counter motions and objections. The family court judge, a weary-looking woman named Judge Miller, initially seemed swayed by Eleanor's portrayal of a concerned grandmother. She ordered me to undergo a full psychiatric assessment and weekly drug testing. She also granted Eleanor supervised visitation with Leo for 2 hours, twice a week, at a neutral third-party facility. Walking into that visitation center for the first time was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I had to hand my son over to a stranger, who then carried him into a brightly colored room where the woman who had tried to destroy me was waiting. Eleanor played the part of the doting grandmother perfectly for the supervisor, cooing over Leo and shooting me looks of pitying sadness over his head. I sat in the waiting area for 2 hours, my stomach in knots, feeling like a prisoner in my own life. The financial pressure mounted. My joint account with Tom was suddenly frozen, a move clearly orchestrated by his father, Robert. My credit cards were declined. I was a stay-at-home mother with no independent income, and they knew it. They were trying to starve me out, to make it impossible for me to continue paying Jessica's legal fees. They thought they could break me, force me to drop the charges and surrender my son. Family members, people I had shared holidays and birthdays with, began to call. Tom's aunts, his cousins. The message was always the same. "You're tearing this family apart, Sarah. Think of what this is doing to Tom. Eleanor loves that baby more than anything. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive her?" They were her flying monkeys, sent to do her emotional bidding, to shame and guilt me into submission. Each call was a fresh wave of betrayal. I learned to stop answering the phone. Through it all, I clung to the process. I went to the psychiatric evaluation, where I spent 6 hours answering deeply personal questions and filling out psychological inventories. I spoke with a calm, clear-headed honesty about what had been done to me. I went to the lab every week and peed in a cup, knowing the results would come back clean, another small brick in the wall of my credibility. And I kept writing in my legal pad, documenting every threatening letter from their lawyers, every manipulative phone call, every micro-expression of hatred Eleanor shot at me during the visitation handoffs. My internal world was a storm. There were days when the despair was so profound I could barely get out of bed. The temptation to give up, to let them win just to make it all stop, was immense. This was my rock-bottom crisis. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly brutal call from Tom's father offering me a generous settlement if I would drop the criminal charges and agree to a joint custody arrangement with Eleanor, I found myself staring at the bottle of sleeping pills in my medicine cabinet. The thought of just slipping away into a quiet, dreamless sleep was seductive. The fight felt too hard. The enemy me too powerful. Then, I heard Leo stir in his crib, a soft coo that was the most beautiful sound in the world. I went to his room and lifted him into my arms, his warm, solid weight a grounding presence against my chest. I looked into his innocent, trusting eyes, and I knew I couldn't give up. I was his protector. I was the only thing standing between him and a woman who saw him as a prize to be won, a pawn in her sick game. My love for him was stronger than their hate, stronger than their money, stronger than my own despair. I flushed the sleeping pills down the toilet and called my sponsor. The fight was not over. The wheels of the criminal justice system turned with excruciating slowness. Detective Miller, the lead investigator on my case, was a methodical, quiet man who seemed unimpressed by the Henderson family's wealth and status. He interviewed me for hours, going over my written timeline with a fine-toothed comb. He interviewed David, who provided his sworn statement about what he had overheard and recorded. He interviewed Tom, whose testimony was weak and conflicted, a man torn between his wife and his mother. The investigation felt like a series of endless, frustrating steps. Subpoenas were issued for Eleanor's medical and pharmacy records, a process her lawyers fought at every turn, citing privacy concerns. A warrant was eventually granted to search her home and computer. I waited, my life on hold, for a breakthrough, for a single piece of concrete evidence that would corroborate my story beyond David's recording. The defense was building their case that the recording was a deepfake, or had been edited and manipulated to incriminate a frail elderly woman. They were creating just enough doubt to make a jury question everything. Weeks turned into months. The legal fees mounted, and I was forced to borrow money from David, a fact that galled me but was necessary for survival. The supervised visits continued, a bi-weekly ritual of torment. Tom and I spoke only through lawyers, our conversations stilted and transactional. The life we had built together was in ruins. Some days, it felt like Eleanor was winning. She was free on bail, living in her mansion, surrounded by a family that supported her, while I was isolated, broke, and fighting for my sanity and my child. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from Jessica. Her voice was different. There was a new energy in it, a sharp edge of excitement. "We got it," she said, without preamble. "The toxicology report on your hair sample came back from the state lab. It's the evidentiary turning point we've been waiting for." I held my breath, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. "And it's definitive," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "They found elevated, long-term exposure to lorazepam, not just 1 or 2 doses, a consistent, systemic pattern of exposure over a period of approximately 8 months. The levels are highest in the most recent growth, and they taper off the further back they go, which is exactly consistent with your timeline of when your symptoms started and worsened. There is no medical record of you ever being prescribed this medication. It's the smoking gun, Sarah. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you were being systematically poisoned." I sank into a kitchen chair, the relief so overwhelming it felt like a physical blow. It was real. It was scientifically, forensically real. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. For months, I had been clinging to my own sanity, to a truth that only I and David knew for sure. Now, I had proof. Cold, hard, scientific proof. The tears that came were not of sorrow or fear, but of profound, cleansing vindication. That toxicology report changed everything. Detective Miller's investigation kicked into a higher gear. Armed with the forensic evidence, he secured a more comprehensive warrant for Eleanor's pharmacy records. And there, they found it. A local, cash-only pharmacy 2 towns over where Eleanor had been getting a recurring prescription for lorazepam filled for the past year. The prescription was in her own name, for anxiety, but the dosage was far higher than what a woman her age and size would typically be prescribed. The pharmacist, when interviewed, remembered her well. He described her as a nervous woman who always paid in cash and seemed agitated. He was a credible witness with no connection to the family. The final piece of the puzzle came from the forensic analysis of her computer's hard drive. They found her search history, how to make someone seem confused, odorless, tasteless sedatives, long-term side effects of benzodiazepines, how to win a custody battle against an unstable mother. It was a digital map of her malicious intent, a step-by-step guide to her own crimes. When Jessica presented all this new evidence to Tom's lawyer, something inside him finally broke. Faced with the irrefutable, scientific proof of his mother's calculated cruelty, the toxicology report, the pharmacy records, the chilling search history, he could no longer cling to his denial. The image of his benevolent, caring mother was shattered forever, replaced by the reality of a manipulative, dangerous criminal. He came to the house that evening, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 months. He stood on the doorstep, his face etched with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "I believe you, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am so sorry. I should have believed you from the beginning. I should have protected you." He finally offered to cooperate fully with the prosecution, to testify against his own mother. He was a repentant enabler, but his repentance had come too late to save our marriage. The trust between us had been ground to dust. "I'm glad you see the truth now, Tom," I told him, my voice devoid of the anger that had sustained me for so long, leaving only a hollow emptiness. "But I can't let you back in. Not now. Maybe not ever." Closing the door on my husband's devastated face was another kind of ending, another loss in a war that had taken so much from me. With the mountain of evidence against her, the district attorney's office felt confident moving forward. The charges were serious: felony assault, child endangerment, and unlawful administration of a controlled substance. Eleanor's legal team, seeing their character assassination strategy was now useless against a wall of forensic evidence, changed tactics. They offered a plea bargain. She would plead guilty to a lesser charge charge of reckless endangerment, serve no jail time, and agree to a permanent restraining order. Jessica and I discussed the offer in her office. "It's a guaranteed conviction," she said, laying out the pros and cons. "No trial, no brutal cross-examination. You wouldn't have to testify. It would all be over." But she wouldn't serve a single day in prison. I thought about it for a long time. The idea of avoiding a trial was tempting. The thought of facing her lawyer, of having my entire life dissected and pathologized on a witness stand, was terrifying. But the thought of her walking away from what she did, of facing no real consequences for her monstrous actions, was unacceptable. She had tried to steal my mind, my child, my life. A slap on the wrist was not justice. "No," I said, my voice firm. "No deal. We're going to trial." Jessica smiled. It was the smile of a shark that had just been given permission to hunt. We would make our strategic decisions based on one principle: no compromise. We would prioritize the felony assault charge and use every piece of evidence to show the depth of her malice and premeditation. The trial began on a cold, gray morning in November, nearly a year and a half after Leo's first birthday. Walking into the courtroom felt like stepping into an arena. The air was heavy with anticipation and hostility. Eleanor sat at the defense table, dressed in a demure navy blue suit, looking like a respectable grandmother, the very picture of wronged innocence. She refused to look at me. Her husband, Robert, sat in the front row of the gallery, his face a stony mask. On the other side of the aisle sat my support system: Uncle David, my sponsor Clara, and my therapist, Dr. Anya Sharma, who had been instrumental in helping me process the trauma and prepare for this day. Tom was not in the gallery. He was sequestered as a witness for the prosecution. The first few days were a blur of jury selection and opening statements. The prosecutor, a sharp, methodical woman named Miss Davies, laid out the case in clear, chronological detail. She painted a picture of a calculated, long-term poisoning, motivated by jealousy and a desire for control. Eleanor's lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Mr. Peterson, countered with the defense they had been building from the start, though it now rang hollow. He portrayed Eleanor as a loving, concerned grandmother who had perhaps made a foolish mistake with some herbal remedies in an attempt to help her highly emotional, unstable daughter-in-law, a woman who was now twisting a gesture of love into a malicious act for financial gain in a divorce. Then, it was my turn to testify. Walking to the witness stand, my heart hammered against my ribs. Every eye in the courtroom was on me. I sat down, my hands trembling in my lap. I avoided looking at the jury, at Eleanor, at anyone. I focused on a small crack in the varnish of the wooden rail in front of me, just as Dr. Sharma had taught me. A grounding technique. Focus on the crack. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. You are here. You are safe. Just tell your truth. Miss Davies began her direct examination gently, leading me through the timeline of events. She had me describe the early days of my marriage, the birth of Leo, the slow, creeping onset of the symptoms. My voice was shaky at first, but as I spoke, as I recounted the details from my legal pad, a strange calm settled over me. I was simply telling my story. The story of the fog, the confusion, the memory loss, the story of the special tonics, and the chamomile tea. Then, Miss Davies played the recording. David had given the original file to the police, and forensic experts had verified its authenticity. As Eleanor's cold, cruel voice filled the silent courtroom, confessing her crimes with such smug satisfaction, I risked a glance at the jury. Their faces were a mixture of shock and disgust. Some of them looked at Eleanor, who sat rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. For the first time, her facade of gentle grandmotherhood was completely shattered, and they were all seeing the monster beneath. The cross-examination was as brutal as Jessica had predicted. Mr. Peterson came at me with everything he had. He brought up my history of anxiety, twisting it into a narrative of chronic mental illness. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Henderson, that you have a documented history of psychiatric problems? Isn't it true that you were once dependent on prescription medication? Isn't it possible that your memory of these events is flawed, colored by your postpartum depression and your pre-existing emotional instability?" I held on to my grounding technique, my eyes fixed on that crack in the wood. I breathed. "I had anxiety after my mother passed away. I took medication as prescribed by my doctor for a short time," I said, my voice steady. "What I experienced for the past year was not anxiety, it was poisoning." He tried to discredit the recording. "You have experience with audio software, don't you? For a podcast you briefly co-hosted in college?" The reach was pathetic, but it was all he had. "Isn't it possible you manipulated that recording to frame your mother-in-law?" "No," I said simply. "That is her voice. That is her confession." He hammered me for hours, trying to trip me up, to make me angry, to make me cry. He wanted the jury to see the hysterical, unstable woman from his opening statement, but I refused to give him that. I answered each question calmly and factually. The woman on the stand was not the broken, confused victim from a year ago. She was a survivor, and my composure was its own form of testimony. When he was finally finished, I walked back to my seat, my legs shaking but my head held high. I had faced him, and I had not broken. The rest of the prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision. The forensic toxicologist took the stand, explaining in dry, scientific detail the results of the hair analysis, showing the jury charts and graphs that mapped the chemical evidence of the crime onto a calendar. The pharmacist from the cash-only pharmacy identified Eleanor in the courtroom and testified about her suspicious prescription refills. The detective testified about the search of her computer, reading her damning search history aloud for the court. Then, Tom took the stand. He looked terrible. He could barely look in his mother's direction. In a low, pained voice, voice. He testified about my deteriorating condition, about his mother's increasing control over our household, about the countless times she had told him I was unwell and not coping. Miss Davies asked him, "Did you ever see your mother put anything in your wife's food or drink?" He shook his head. "No, but she was always the one making it." His testimony was a portrait of a man who had been willfully blind, a classic enabler, and his shame was palpable. Mr. Peterson's cross-examination was brief and gentle. He didn't want to alienate the jury by attacking a son who was so clearly in agony. The final witness for the prosecution was Uncle David. He calmly recounted the events of Leo's birthday party, describing how he had grown concerned by my state and had lingered in the hallway, only to overhear Eleanor's monstrous confession. He was an unshakable witness, a man of simple, honest dignity, and the jury listened to him with rapt attention. The defense presented a weak case, calling only a handful of character witnesses family friends who testified that Eleanor was a pillar of the community and a devoted grandmother. It was flimsy and unconvincing against the mountain of forensic evidence and the chilling power of the recording. Eleanor did not take the stand. Her lawyer knew the prosecutor would tear her apart. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Mr. Peterson pleaded for sympathy, painting Eleanor as a misguided old woman and me as a vindictive opportunist. Miss Davies, in her closing, was a force of nature. She walked the jury back through every piece of evidence, from the first subtle symptoms to the final, damning search history entry. She held up the toxicology report. "This is not emotion," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is not a family squabble. This is science. This is the unassailable proof of a cold, calculated, long-term assault on a young mother designed to strip her of her sanity, her credibility, and ultimately, her child." She ended by playing the last few seconds of the recording one final time. Eleanor's voice, smug and triumphant. "I'll take such good care of him. Of both of them." The silence that followed was absolute. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were grim and set. I held my breath, my hands gripping David's on one side and Jessica's on the other. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a tired face, stood and unfolded a piece of paper. "On the charge of felony assault, we the jury find the defendant, Eleanor Henderson." He paused, and in that split second, the entire world seemed to stop. "Guilty." A gasp went through the courtroom. I felt a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escape my lips. It was over. They believed me. They found her guilty on the other 2 counts as well: child endangerment and unlawful administration of a controlled substance. Eleanor sat frozen, her face ashen. Her husband, Robert, slumped in his seat as if he had been physically struck. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later. Miss Davies argued for the maximum sentence, highlighting the long-term psychological trauma and the heinous breach of trust. Mr. Peterson begged for leniency, citing Eleanor's age, her lack of a prior record, and her contributions to the community. The judge listened impassively. When he delivered the sentence, it was the bittersweet verdict I had been bracing for. He spoke of the profound cruelty and shocking premeditation of her crimes, but in the end, he sentenced her to 10 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years, for trying to dismantle my entire existence, for the months of terror and confusion, for the loss of my marriage, for the trauma that would follow me for the rest of my life. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. It was a number. It was a consequence. It was an acknowledgement from the system that what she did was real, and it was wrong. It was incomplete justice, but it was the only justice I was going to get. As the bailiffs led a weeping Eleanor out of the courtroom, I did not feel triumph. I just felt tired, deeply, profoundly tired. The end of the trial was not the end of the story. It was simply the end of a chapter. The quiet aftermath was, in some ways, harder than the fight itself. The adrenaline that had sustained me for so long dissipated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a landscape of grief. I grieved for the woman I was before, for the marriage I had lost, for the family I thought I had. My therapy sessions with Dr. Sharma became my sanctuary. It was there that I grappled with the imperfect verdict. The legal system is designed to punish actions, not to heal trauma, she told me during one session. The sentence was never going to feel like enough, because no amount of prison time can give you back what you lost. Justice, for you, is not going to be found in a courtroom. It's going to be found in the life you build from now on. It's found in your healing. Her words became my mantra. I began the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. The divorce from Tom was finalized quickly and quietly. He didn't fight me on anything. I got full custody of Leo, the house, and a generous alimony and child support settlement funded by a man consumed by guilt. He saw Leo on weekends, and our interactions were polite and distant, ghosts haunting the ruins of a life we once shared. I knew he was in his own therapy, trying to understand how he had been so blind, but whether he could ever truly untangle himself from the web of his mother's influence was a question I could no longer afford to care about. My focus had to be on myself and my son. Practical recovery was a series of small, forward movements. I started a support group for survivors of psychological abuse by family members. Telling my story, and hearing the stories of others, was profoundly healing. It broke the isolation that had been Eleanor's most powerful weapon. I rediscovered my love for writing, not on legal pads detailing my trauma, but in journals, exploring my own thoughts and feelings, reclaiming my inner voice. I took Leo to the park, to Mommy and Me classes, to the library. I filled our days with simple, gentle joys, creating new, happy memories to overlay the dark ones. I was determined that his childhood would be defined by love and safety, not by the shadow of his grandmother's crimes. The hardest but most necessary step was establishing permanent, non-negotiable boundaries. I changed my phone number. I blocked every member of the Henderson family and their enablers on social media. When letters from Tom's aunts arrived, filled with pleas for reconciliation and accusations of cruelty for keeping a grandmother from her grandson, I threw them in the fire without reading past the first sentence. The severance had to be absolute. They were part of the sickness, and I was choosing health. My new family was small but solid. Me, Leo, Uncle David, and a tight-knit circle of friends and fellow survivors who understood. There are still bad days. A certain scent will remind me of Eleanor's perfume, and my stomach will clench with anxiety. A news story about gaslighting will send my heart racing. The scars are permanent. The trauma is now a part of my story, a dark thread woven into the fabric of who I am. But it is not the whole story. It is not even the most important part. The most important part is that I survived. I fought back. I won. Not a perfect victory, not a Hollywood ending, but a real one. Tonight, Leo is 3 years old. He's asleep in his bed, his breath a soft, rhythmic whisper in the quiet house. I'm sitting in the living room, the same room where my world fell apart, but it's different now. It's my space. I repainted the walls a warm, sunny yellow. The furniture is new. The air is clear. I look at my reflection in the dark window pane. I see the lines of worry around my eyes that weren't there before. I see the strength in my jaw that I never knew I had. I see a survivor. I see a mother. I see a woman who went through hell and walked out the other side, dragging her monster into the light. Justice was incomplete, but my healing is not. It is ongoing, it is deliberate, and it is mine. And in that, I find a quiet, resilient, and profound peace. I am finally, truly safe. You know, for a story that started with a birthday party, it got pretty dark, didn't it? If you made it all the way through that, you deserve a medal, or at least a very strong cup of tea, one that you make for yourself just to be safe. Seriously though, you have the attention span of a gosh darn champion, and for that, I salute you. If you want more tales of questionable in-laws and hard-won victories, you know what to do. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It's way less complicated than filing a lawsuit, I promise.